The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2023 to Narges Mohammadi for her fight against
the Nobel Peace Prize is one of the most prestigious awards in the world. Every year, the director of the Peace Research Institute Oslo, or PRIO, gives his own list of individuals and organizations he believes are worthy of the prize. The list is completely independent from the Norwegian Nobel Committee and is his own evaluation of those who've worked tirelessly for peace and deserve particular recognition. Today, I speak to Henrik Urdal, PRIO's director, about his list. We're joined by Berit Reiss-Andersen, special advisor to the Norwegian Red Cross, who spent over a decade as a member of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, a very select group of individuals tasked with choosing the recipients of the famous prize. Also joining us is Maria Ressa, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021 alongside Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression. I am Arno Siad, and you're listening to PRIO's Peace in a Pod. Berit, Henrik, Maria, welcome to this episode. Henrik, I'll start by asking you a simple question. According to the rules and statutes around the Nobel Peace Prize, directors of Peace Research Institutes, like you, have the possibility to submit nominations for the prize. However, year after year, you abstain from doing so. Why is that?
So as the director of PRIO, I'm involved in the public speculations and discussions about potential candidates. And there are two main reasons why I refrain from nominating myself. One is that it's important for me to underscore that PRIO is not involved in the actual selection of the prize winners. And so by not nominating, I'm underscoring that there is no formal links between PRIO and the Nobel Institute and the committee. And second, I want to make sure that I'm communicating that PRIO doesn't have any stakes in this. We don't have any interests. We are talking about potential good candidates, and we don't want that to be mixed up with proposing candidates directly for the Peace Prize.
So for our listeners at home, you are not deciding who will win the Nobel Peace Prize.
Not at all.
This leads me to you, Berit. Your voice will be recognizable to many listeners, the lady who year after year was announcing the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. That was you, we heard at the very top of the intro to this episode. You were a member of the Norwegian Nobel Committee for over a decade. We have established that Henrik does not exercise his right to nominate candidates. So how does the Norwegian Nobel Committee view Henrik's list year after year? Does it inspire you? Do you pay any attention to it?
I have to reveal a secret. We do pay attention to it. It's always interesting. Well, of course, the committee always considers, when we are doing the final selection, how will our candidate be perceived? Will the prize be understood? Does it communicate for peace? And then in that context, it's very interesting reading the speculations. Some, I have thought, they are so far off and away from what has been our agenda. And sometimes it worries me how well they match. Sometimes you think there is a leak, and sometimes perhaps there has been a leak. But for the past years, I feel if you're really interested in these issues, obviously, the members of the committee are not the only individuals in the world who are thinking in a certain direction.
That's fascinating. And Maria, I'm so glad we have you on this panel as someone who has actually won the Nobel Peace Prize.
The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2021 to Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression, which is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. Ms. Ressa and Ms.
So, how did winning the prize impact your work? Has it been a game changer? I mean, in other words, is it the big deal we think it is?
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. I mean, right after I had lost my right to travel, right, court approvals. Actually, it came at the bleakest of times for me, and I just was getting ready to go to jail. If that makes any sense, how do you make yourself mentally prepared? But right after the announcement, I received my right to travel back. The court started saying yes, and then that's the easy short-term one. The long-term one is I say the same things I've always said, but sometimes it seems like people now listen differently.
May I add, Desmond Tutu made a statement once where he said the exact same thing. He said something to the effect of, before I said intelligent things and nobody listened to me, and now even when I say rubbish, everybody listens to me.
Now moving on to Henrik's list itself. I'll start with what surprised me in your list. The very top of it consists of international organizations, the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, UNRWA, the UN agency supporting Palestinian refugees, the International Court of Justice, UNESCO, the Council of Europe, and I'll get to those individually in a minute, but we see that conflict levels are very high right now around the world. Our own research here at PRIO shows that last year saw the highest number of conflicts since World War II. Many will think that international organizations are indeed failing us right now. So why are they making the top of your list?
First, I would like to say that quite often we put organizations on our list, despite the fact that quite often the committee points to individuals and individual achievements. And part of the reason is that the aim with the PRIO list is to highlight thematic areas that we think are important. And so pointing to organizations that do important work is a way to sort of cover broad ground. And then there are a number of reasons why international organizations aren't having the effect that we hope they would these days. And that's not primarily the fault of these organizations, but a result of the increasing polarization internationally. I think it is extremely important to emphasize the role that multilateral spaces have for states to come together to solve problems, and many of these organizations are doing incredibly important work, and for us it's important to highlight all of these achievements that perhaps we don't recognize and see on the everyday basis.
I would like to add that international organizations and institutions can only fully reach their purpose with a certain amount of political support. When that political support fades, they really can't operate as efficiently. And I would also like to add another reason why organizations really have place when you speculate in who will be this year's Nobel laureate is really just looking at the terms of Alfred Nobel's will. It's a clause that perhaps needs a little bit of explanation that says support and promoting peace congresses. And over the history of the Peace Prize, this has been interpreted to be not the exact peace congresses of the 19th century, but international organizations and institutions. So it's one of the three categories according to the will, and therefore should be considered.
I'll get back to that in a moment, but I'd like to go back to you, Henrik, about what would be easily the most controversial pick in your list, UNRWA, the UN agency supporting Palestinian refugees, and its chief, Philippe Lazzarini. To you, this is one of the organizations worthy of the Nobel Peace Prize this year. Of course, we know that Israel has alleged that some UNRWA staff had participated in the October 7th attacks last year. So can you tell us why you picked UNRWA and Lazzarini? And do you think the potential controversy could deter the committee from awarding the prize to them?
I think it's right that it would be a controversial prize, but I don't think it should be controversial. It's an incredibly important organization set up in 1949, actually turning 75 years this year. which is making a huge difference to almost 6 million Palestinians, both in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in neighboring countries. It's providing education, it's providing basic services to a population in great need. And of course, with the war in Gaza, this is more important than ever. It's the only sort of major lifeline for many Palestinian refugees now. And so focusing on the important role that humanitarian organizations like UNRWA is doing is absolutely essential. It's also important to say that UNRWA has a zero tolerance when it comes to their staff. They have 30,000 staff, and I said very clearly that if there is any suspicion of a link with militant organizations, people will be dismissed. And so the role of UNRWA is to serve the humanitarian needs, and that is why we put it on the list.
And Berit, back to you. Henrik said UNRWA and its chief, Philip Lazzarini. It makes me wonder how the committee thinks about organizations versus individuals as winners. And I think you touched upon that just before. But having a face on a prize would, I assume, typically get more attention internationally. It's easier to relate to an individual with a personal story versus a faceless organization. But is this something the committee considers?
Well, we always consider how does the prize communicate? And that's part of it. But our loyalty is first and foremost to the terms of the will. And there's 3 equal clauses in the will, fraternity, where under the hat of the human right related prizes have been given, disarmament prizes, and then the contribution to peace congresses, institutions and organizations. So it's not the primarily concern, but of course to have individual enthusiasm and dedication like Maria represented and Dmitry Muratov, who also won the prize, is of course of enormous value. When we come to the individual prizes, we do ask ourselves the question, is this individual able to and worthy of carrying the mantle of the Nobel Peace Prize? And I think that is a necessary consideration to make. But it doesn't, when you look at our history, we revisit all different alternatives of the will, relatively fair over the years, over a certain period of time.
And Berit, you just spoke about what the committee is concerned with when picking a laureate. And Maria said earlier how consequential a win is on someone's life. I wonder how the committee thinks around putting laureates at risk. I think of Narges Mohammadi, who won the prize last year while in prison in Iran and really at the mercy of the Iranian government. So, when possible, does the committee provide any protection to winners? Do you take that into consideration when awarding the prize?
Well, as you know, I cannot reveal the specific considerations we have made in the committee. That's also a clause of Alfred Nobel's will, that the secrecy. But I can make the general observation that, of course, you cannot totally disregard the dangers that might be bestowed upon a person. But on the other hand, anybody who has given a contribution that is Nobel Peace Prize worthy has also made a choice of taking a great risk and dedicating his or her life to a cause. And I think you have to balance these considerations somehow, and you cannot really absolutely generalize. It has to be a specific consideration that you make.
Maria, my next question is to you, and in relation to what Berit was just saying. I mean, during your work at Rappler, of course, you put yourself at considerable risk then, and I'm wondering whether you've experienced any challenges to you personally or your journalistic work after being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
You know, that question that you asked, Berit, and the two, I mean, I think the first one is that you're already on the path that you're on, and so you put one foot in front of the other. And it was actually in 2018 with the Time Person of the Year, where, the first time you get a punch in the gut when you're named, and you think you're still trying to negotiate with power, right? If that makes sense, because we never chose to actively negotiate with an authoritarian ruler. We just kept doing our jobs. But the first time was in 2018, and then I think, I have been so lucky as we kept going. The Nobel Prize literally protected us. It shielded us. It shielded me. It shielded Rappler. And talking about dangers, everyone asks me that. And I always say, I can like step off the sidewalk and get run over by a car tomorrow. Like, what dangers are we talking about, right? If you're a journalist at this point in time and you had a news group, there's certain risks that come with that. So you'd better meet it head on. I think the other part is it's fascinating to me because I also ask this from Berit, and she doesn't say, but we're not supposed to know for 50 years, so you should keep asking her. Committee to protect journalists versus us, right? Like versus Dmitry and myself. I guess it's that. It's the organization versus individuals. I will say for me and for Rappler, I think, when that announcement happened, it every I had worked for 20 years in international news organizations, and every journalist, I think, felt like, oh my God, it's an acknowledgement of how difficult it is to keep doing our jobs. And if you look at after 2021, the choices of the committee, you have after the journalist in 2022, it was civil society, the civil society under attack. Ales Bilyatsky, Belarus, Ukraine. My gosh, Alexandra Matviichik, who founded Center for Civil Liberties, she's like walking wounded. Every time I see her, I just want to hug her, right? And then Memorial, of course, right? So that's 2022. And what's 2023? Nargis Mohammadi, an Iranian woman. It almost is like of the moment. This is my way of saying, Berit, wow, excellent. It's of the moment, right? It shines the light and allows everyone else to shift on Palestine and what is happening in Gaza. It's funny coming from the UN General Assembly, right? When Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke, he was followed by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who went on and addressed the humanitarian issues when you bring up the list right now, right? I think this time requires tremendous leadership. And it's ironic to me that at least in what I have seen in the UN, it's been the women. Of course, the Secretary General has been pushing forever, but the women under attack are, it's compounded. So I'm looking forward to who this year's Nobel winners are going to be. But the number of journalists killed, highest, and as of this is Committee to Protect Journalists numbers. Last year 75% of the journalists killed were in Gaza.
Yes, and that's actually my next question to you, Maria. I mean, as a former journalist myself, I've been very distressed about the number of reporters killed in Gaza, right? And indeed, the Committee to Protect Journalists said at least 116 journalists and media workers have been among the 42,000 killed. And I believe this is, according to the CPJ, the deadliest period for journalists in 3 decades. So, Maria, I'm wondering whether you think that either the CPJ or journalists should be perhaps recognized this year as recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize. What's your thoughts on that?
It's so funny. I mean, I say this all the time, right? And Berit, I think, has said this. The attacks against journalists have increased hand in hand with the decline of democracy. And this has been going on for the last 16 years. Like I would say the last 2 decades, we have been forced to sacrifice more just to keep doing our jobs. But it's not just that you cannot now actually be in Gaza as a reporter. It's also the fact that all around the world, what was used to radicalize suicide bombers, right? Because sorry, I'm going to pull a few things together here, which is our public information ecosystem is so corrupted that it is literally allowing the manipulation at the cellular level of a democracy, the people. And we are globally electing illiberal leaders democratically. So Berit said, that you need political will. Well, that's part of the reason the political will is seeping out. On the journalists, we're on the front lines, but we've known this. It's just never been as bad as it is today, even as our organizations are hemorrhaging money because that is going directly to big tech, which is the beginning of the corruption of the public information ecosystem, right? When lies spread 6 times faster than facts. That's a 2018 MIT study, and it's gotten significantly worse today. That impacts everything else. It turns our values upside down. In the Nobel lecture in 2021, I referred to this. An atom bomb exploded in our information ecosystem, and we are pumped full of toxic sludge. You can't disconnect the death of journalists and the death of democracy, right? Because it is the quality, the integrity of information that we need to keep democracies alive. And the killings of journalists is just, I hate to say that about us, but the sacrifices we make, that's just like you're watching death by 1,000 cuts. And it must stop. And we need the leadership to make that stop. So I'm looking forward to who wins the Nobel Peace Prize this year.
But I would like to add a comment because you're touching a very deep historical line here, Maria, because it's a well-established Peace Prize tradition that conveying and communicating the horrors of war in itself is a contribution to peace. The first Nobel Peace Prize went to Henri Dunant, who wrote about the horrors of the Battle of Soliferno. And there I managed to connect my old and my new role because he founded Red Cross as a consequence of what he observed. So I fully agree with you, Maria, but this is a deep tradition. Journalists play a special role as peacemakers, both to strengthen civil society, but even more to tell the world about the horrors of war.
What's really tears my heart apart is the actual attacks on journalists, many of whom are dying, right? That is tearing credibility apart and tearing the trust of this is part of what's destroying our democracies. Oh, look, I get emotional on this.
No, that's completely understandable. And Henrik, to go back to your list, and as we talk about, Maria talked about death by 1,000 cuts, but the International Court of Justice, it's one of your picks this year. And the court made headlines in January when it ordered Israel to prevent acts of genocide in Gaza. Israel has fiercely rejected the idea that it may be committing a genocide in Gaza. It claims it's Hamas who is perpetrating a genocide. So, Henrik, can you tell us why the ICJ made it to your list?
So the International Court of Justice is the UN court that solves disputes between states based in The Hague. It's one of the most important mechanisms that we have for resolution of conflicts of interest between states, and they've had, as you noted, a ruling in the case of the war in Gaza, but also a recent ruling on the Ukraine with demanding that Russia ceases operations in Ukraine. So it has been ruling in recent important cases, and it would be a way, as Berit also said, to reward the broader domain of peace congresses. It's a place where states come together to solve problems peacefully, and ICJ is an important mechanism.
And Maria spoke of democracy earlier, and 2024 is said to be a record year for elections. Of course, over 60 countries holding national elections. That's more than 2 billion voters heading to the polls. And many of these elections are being closely monitored by the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, which sits within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And you've listed them, Henrik, as worthy recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize. Tell us a little more.
We know from research that democracy is very closely related to peace and stability. We also know that election observers are important in overseeing one of the most important institutions of democracy, the free and fair elections. It should be said, though, that not all of the elections this year will be in fair and free settings, and not all countries doing elections are necessarily democratic, but the election observers are performing an incredibly important role in making sure that it's being communicated to the public, both in the countries where the elections are held, but also internationally, whether, the basic rules, the basic expectations of elections are being observed. And so giving the prize to those who are making that important role is something I think would give a very strong signal internationally about the importance of free and fair elections and those who are monitoring that situation.
And Berit, we touched upon some of the considerations that come into play when selecting a winner, and many of our listeners are very curious about what's going on behind closed doors, what's cooking in the kitchen of the Norwegian Nobel Committee. So I want to ask you a bit more about that process. First, for our listeners, the Norwegian Nobel Committee is made up of 5 members. Can you talk to us about how those 5 members are typically appointed? What sort of profiles do they tend to have?
Oh, that's not such an easy question to answer because it has changed over the years. But according to Alfred Nobel's will, it is the Norwegian Parliament who appoints the members to the Nobel Committee. And when you put a task to a political institution like a parliament, of course, they make politics out of their choices. So it's established that tradition that the most dominant parties in the parliament have the right to appoint the member of the committee, and it's sort of a rotating system. I won't go too much into the details of that. Traditionally, or for a long period of time, historically, it was people with a very heavy political background. We even had, in the early years of the committee, a functioning Minister of Foreign Affairs as a member of the committee. And as times have changed, and I think I was perhaps one of the first, not the first person with a sort of general professional background of interest in international affairs, who was appointed to the committee. I did have a sort of party bond, but not a very strong one. I've sort of just spent a small part of my life being involved in politics. And that opened up for a tendency more and more not selecting people who have held very high political offices. The advantage is obviously that it strengthens the independency of the committee and the ties to the current government.
And you mentioned the independence of the committee as being sort of pivotal to their role. But of course, the members of the committee are made public. Everyone can and has access to who sits on the committee at any given time. So while you were part of the committee, did you ever experience external pressure? I mean, are there protections and procedures in place to ensure your decision is free of unwanted outside influence?
Absolutely. We have internal rules of what we have to report and what we have to consider. Of course, being a member of the committee, you get a lot of attention. You are invited to functions, speaking, etc. And some of it is part of your job. And particularly as a chair, I looked at my role as being also an ambassador for the committee and for the Nobel values. So to a certain extent, you have to communicate publicly, but you have to be very observant and very careful about the favors that comes along with it. Blatant attempts of influencing me, I can say, honest to God, I've never been exposed to. But indirect attempts, I cannot. Perhaps they have taken place. I don't know.
And some of us will remember the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize which was awarded to the late Chinese human rights activist Liu Xiaobo, then in prison. And that was before your time on the committee, Berit. But it created a diplomatic rift between China and Norway at the time. Is this something you were ever concerned with as you handed the prize, the potential ramifications for Norway and its standing around the world?
Well, I would say we are, of course, conscious of that we are awarding the world's most important prize, and that it always will get international attention and criticism. So it's a general consideration we always make, which does not mean that we shun away from conflict or controversy. I think we have proved in our history that we have taken risks, we have made controversial decisions, and the courage to do that is part of the credibility of the prize. And it's not a Norwegian prize. It just happens to live in Norway. I usually say we're part of a global family that has two houses, one in Stockholm and one in Oslo.
Henrik?
I would even say it a little bit more strongly than what you say, Berit, is that part of the rationale, part of the strength of the prize is that the committee dares to go into controversial issues and take, to highlight important contributions despite the fact that there are those who will be unhappy about the prize. And I think the committee has made some important choices in that regard.
Thank you. I was just being a bit modest.
And Henrik, I want to ask you about some of the picks on your list. Let's start with Sudan and the emergency response rooms. What are those and why did they make it to your list?
So Sudan's emergency response rooms is a local network of humanitarian initiatives that were established by the pro-democracy movement in Sudan. Keep in mind that Sudan is one of the forgotten emergencies in the world today, one of the conflicts that are not getting the attention that they deserve. There are so many important bottom-up initiatives that save lives on the ground in conflicts like the Sudan, and the Sudan's emergency response rooms is one such organization that is doing absolutely essential and very important work that I think could very well be the focus of the committee.
And you also listed UNESCO and the Council of Europe. It takes me back to my earlier question of why. I mean, it would feel like organizations have failed in their mandate to bring about peace between people, whether via education or democratic institutions, or in fact, forget about the overarching mandate. Some might question why we would be rewarding them when they are simply doing their day-to-day job. So why are they on your list?
So these are organizations that I think would speak very well to this domain that Berit was mentioning, the fraternity between nations and the importance of, in this case, developing standards for teaching history simply as a way to communicate to the world that what is binding us together, what is commonly human, and fighting these nationalist, very narrow historical narratives that sometimes are the major sources of conflict. And so both the Council of Europe and UNESCO have been important in developing these multi-perspective history teaching guides, which I think is, again, something that is not getting a lot of attention, but very, very important foundational work for building understanding and peace between people.
And the committee has visited that issue by the Peace Prize to the European Union as a peacemaking body and uniting former enemies in political cooperation and development.
And Berit, we've spoken a lot on this episode about controversial decisions by the Norwegian Nobel Committee and how the committee has not been afraid of making some decisions in the past. As you reflect on your decade of service on the committee, do you have any regrets when it comes to decisions made during that time? I'm thinking about Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia, who was awarded the prize in 2019.
The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2019 to Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali for his efforts to achieve peace and international cooperation, and in particular for his decisive initiative to resolve the border conflict with neighboring Eritrea. The prize...
Yet, just a year later, he led his country into a war with the Tigray region and has since faced accusations of human rights violations, media censorship, persecutions of ethnic groups. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thought on that is that at the time when Abiy Ahmed received the Peace Prize, in my opinion, I will still defend the position that he really deserved the Peace Prize. He had negotiated a peace with Eritrea. It was a total change of regime in Ethiopia. He had released political prisoners, introduced freedom of press and freedom of information, and truly made great political efforts of involving women in society. In that region, with Ethiopia's history, I think that was, at the time, a great contribution to peace in Ethiopia and an example on the African Horn. The committee, this might surprise you, but we are not clairvoyant. We cannot look into the future. So I will defend that we can only assess a situation as it looked at the time when the prize was given.
Henrik?
I think that's an important point, is that the committee is awarding the prize for something that has been achieved, and there is no guarantee what will happen downstream. And there are other laureates who've also been, doing things that are worthy of critique sort of after they've received the prize. But I think it's important to also highlight that the prize has also served as a platform for criticizing Abiy Ahmed. He was getting much more attention for his misbehavior than he otherwise would have gotten had it not been for the prize. And that goes for Aung San Suu Kyi and others as well, that there are expectations of a prize winner that simply don't apply to just everyone. And the Nobel Peace Prize has been a way to also say to Abiy that, we expect more of you.
And I think also it's, what keeps up the importance of the prize is that the committee, to a certain extent, has to take risks. We took a great risk when we gave the Peace Prize to Malala, 17 years old. Mm. We also, the same with Rigoberta Menchú, pre-Malala, she was the youngest recipient. She was 30 years old, and it was the first time the committee visited the issue of the rights of indigenous people and the effects of colonialism. And I think we need to take those risks. If we wait until everything is settled and over and done, it will be more a historical prize. And it's exactly that. It can be a statement as things are fragile, and perhaps also be an aspiration for a positive development. And then it's not always that positive development necessarily takes place.
I think it's an important point that you just made about how the committee always tries to make a statement and how much that is important to them. And as we wrap this episode, I have a last question for the three of you. Some people argue that the Nobel Peace Prize should not be awarded this year. And the last time this happened was in 1972. And the thinking goes that given the number of conflicts in the world today, how can we award a peace prize at such a time? So I'd like to ask all of you what you say to that. I'll start with you, Berit.
Well, I hope there will be a peace prize this year. Because the terms of the will, again, it's to give it to the person or the institution that has given the greatest contribution to peace. I'm sure somewhere on this globe, despite what the world looks like today, there is such a contribution. I truly believe that.
Henrik?
Absolutely. I'm very certain that there will be a Peace Prize this year. I don't think that the committee is in doubt. And I think it's also important to, I mean, there are so many organizations, so many people working for peace that finding good contributions is really not that hard. And we need some hope in this world with more conflict. And I think the Peace Prize is one of those important hopes that remind us about all of the good things that are being done.
Maria, last words for you?
I think it's even more important this year. I think there are two strands that the world has been pressured under. I think the first one is, this concept, largely again, the technology that connects it is insidiously manipulating us. It has turned what we had hoped would be the wisdom of the crowd into a mob, and hand in hand with something like that is the role of fear. And you can see this, even in UNGA, even in the United Nations General Assembly, right? So the question is, where is the leadership that will catapult the world out of this quicksand moment where we're going down the drain? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm a journalist, so I have more visual words, right? It is really, which is the reason why the Peace Prize is much more important. We must stem the bleeding, literally and figuratively. And as was mentioned, where do we find hope? I think that's the role and we need to work. This is it. So Berit, be wonderful.
Well, I have no influence this year. I'm out of the committee, but a wonderful statement, Maria.
Maria, Henrik, Berit, thank you very much. This episode was produced by Arno Siad and Nora Josephson and was edited by Brage Pedersen with sounds from the Nobel Prize. Find out more about PRIO's cutting-edge research, events, blog posts and publications on PRIO.org.